Sybil Birling is described as a rather cold woman in an Inspector Calls, and she certainly seems to live up to that name. After all, who would deny a desperate pregnant woman the help she so clearly needed? But is she simply an unfeeling monster, or is there another side to her that we aren't seeing? Let's take a look at Sybil Birling's situation in life when we first meet her. She is an upper middle class woman who married beneath her station, as she is described as Mr. Birling's social superior. However, she is still in an extremely privileged position, wealthy, outwardly respectable, and very involved in the community, as she is a prominent member of the Brumley Women's Charity Organisation. All this privilege comes with a heavy sense of entitlement and moral superiority over those she considers beneath her. She immediately comes off as snobby and cold when she tells off her husband for complimenting the cook, saying, reproachfully, "Arthur, you're not supposed to say such things." This sort of behaviour, although very off-putting to a modern audience, was really quite normal for women in her social class. So, Mrs. Birling's snobbish attitude is emphasized by Priestley to criticize the hypocritical holier-than-thou values of the upper class, who judged a person's morals and worth by their wealth and privilege. In the early 1900s, when this play was set, women were not considered equal to men, and did not have the right to vote or work in positions of power. They were completely under the thumb of their husbands or parents, and Mrs. Birling is a great example of this. She is above her husband socially, as Arthur Birling made his money rather than inherited it, but you would never know this by the way she acts. She voluntarily exits the room to "leave you men," as was the tradition at the time after dinner, and instead of siding with her daughter, who rightly wants to spend more time with her fiancé, tells her, "You'll have to get used to that." She not only tolerates gender inequality, but advocates it, and this is highlighted by Priestley as one of the problems of society. Women like her that were set in their ways and had a privileged, comfortable life were unable to see the need for change and equality because they had no concept of the kind of struggles that women like Eva faced on a daily basis. When we compare her reluctance to challenge these norms with Sheila's wholehearted rejection of them later on by giving Gerald back his ring, it is clear that Priestley is showing that there was a generational divide in attitudes towards gender equality. Speaking of rings and fiancés, to Sybil Birling, marriage is not about love. It is a transaction to secure financial stability, and in Sheila's case, elevate one's social status. There are no signs of affection between her and her husband, or even towards her children really, and their house is described as not cozy or home-like, which shows that their familial relationships are just out of obligation and not based on real love. In fact, Sybil's interactions with her children reveal a lot about her character, as she is dismissive of Sheila's opinions and concerns, and pretends to be oblivious to Eric's struggles with drinking. Her main priority is maintaining the family's social image, and although she expresses disappointment in Eric's behavior at the end, saying, "I'm absolutely ashamed of you," and seems to be shocked about Gerald's affair with Eva, calling it disgusting several times, her statements are more about their failure to meet the expectations of society rather than genuine concern for the well-being of her son or the emotional distress the affair will cause her daughter. In fact, she hints at the beginning that she has been through the same thing herself, as she says, "When you're married, you'll realize that men with important work to do sometimes have to spend nearly all their time and energy on their business. You'll have to get used to that, just as I had." If Mr. Birling was acting the same as Gerald, who was off having an affair, it is only too likely that he was keeping mistresses for much of their marriage as well. But why would she, a rich woman with a higher social standing than her husband, put up with all that? Essentially, it all boils down to her pride. Pride is Mrs. Birling's biggest flaw, and if we look at an Inspector Calls like a morality play, something which I talk about more in my other analysis videos, she would definitely represent pride, which is one of Christianity's 7 deadly sins. In a nutshell, morality plays were big in medieval times, and used personifications of sins or virtues like pride, lust, greed, or faith, to teach a moral lesson to the audience. Sybil's pride blinds her to all the problems of society that are staring her in the face, and she is so set on insisting that the classist system she was raised in is the only way to exist that she comes off as almost delusional. This is quite ironic considering her name is Sybil, because in ancient Greece, a Sybil was an oracle or prophetess who was able to predict future events. Mrs. Birling definitely does not live up to that name though, as she is totally unwilling to acknowledge the uncomfortable realities of life, like Alderman Meggerty's sexual harassment of women, or Eric's drinking problem, and chooses to deny it or pretend to be shocked instead. Of course, the climax of this delusion comes at the end of Act 2, when she allows herself to be blindly led into condemning her own son for impregnating Eva and stealing from their family. In the society Sybil was raised in, you were expected to hide all your dirty little secrets and keep a so-called respectable appearance, or risk social ruin. So to Sybil, the loss of their pristine family image is far worse than the crimes they have all committed. This attitude is exposed at the end of the play, when they start to suspect that the inspector may not be a real inspector after all. She is practically gleeful at this discovery, never mind the fact that she played a hand in the death of her grandchild, or that her son is guilty of rape and theft. None of this matters, so long as their social reputation stays intact. And the reason she insists on maintaining these fake appearances and returning everything back to how it was also goes back to her pride. Because if she admits that she is to blame, if she admits that her son is an alcoholic and a rapist, if she admits that the classist society she has been advocating for is rotten and needs to change, then she is admitting that her whole life has been wasted. She has been chained to her husband's authority, endured a loveless marriage, multiple mistresses, and has likely led an incredibly lonely existence without one real, genuine connection. And for what? If her social reputation is in tatters, or if the class system ceases to exist, then all that she has stood for and silently suffered has been for nothing. When we look at it from this perspective, we can see that while Sybil is part of the problem, perpetrating this system of oppression for so many, she is also a victim of it, and has stopped herself from achieving anything notable in life, or spending it with people that she cares about, which is actually quite sad. But to admit that now at this point in her life would be far too painful for her pride, and so it's much easier to pretend that everything is alright. It is hardly surprising then that when Inspector Gould marches in with his disruptive ideas about social responsibility, she is extremely resistant to any sort of change. When confronted with the consequences of her actions, her immediate reaction is to deflect the blame as much as possible, saying, "First the girl herself. Secondly, I blame the young man." She absolutely refuses to take any personal responsibility for Eva's death, quite literally stating, "I accept no blame for it at all." Her refusal to budge at all on this point is quite shocking, especially considering that Eva was pregnant when she took her own life, and her denial of aid was probably the final straw that caused that. However, we already know that she is very prejudiced against the working classes, whom she sees as inferior and undeserving of sympathy. In fact, when she first hears about Eva's death, she says very callously, "I don't suppose for a moment we can understand why that girl committed suicide. Girls of that class..." So it's no big shock that when Eva came to her for help that she showed absolutely no compassion and cited her impertinence at using the name Mrs. Birling as reason enough for turning her away, blatantly admitting, "That prejudiced me against her case." To her, Eva's cry for help comes off as scammy and offensive, rather than the last act of desperation from someone who has been miserably failed by society. But was there any justification behind her refusal? Because Mrs. Birling is so unlikable, it is very easy to immediately condemn her actions. But let's put ourselves into her shoes for a moment and see if it really is that black and white. As the audience, we have heard all about Eva's string of misfortunes and abuses, so of course we are extremely sympathetic to what she has gone through. Mrs. Birling, on the other hand, wouldn't have known all that, and simply gone by what Eva told her about her situation, which, to be completely frank, was, as she put it, a pack of lies. She lied about her name and her marital situation, and admitted she was lying, so it doesn't exactly put her in the best position to be accepted for a charitable donation. Of course, her treatment of Eva was cruel and harsh, but in completely practical terms, Charities at that time had limited funds to distribute, meaning that not everybody could be approved for aid. And the fact that Eva used Mrs. Birling's own name to apply for it gave her an easy no out of the hundreds of others who probably applied as well. But the larger issue that Priestley is highlighting is that women like Eva shouldn't have had to go through women like Sybil, with no qualifications and a deep-seated prejudice against the working class, in order to get help. What the country really needed was a welfare state that would treat people in need fairly, rather than privately funded charities. I personally think that Sybil Birling is quite a complex character, and not as two-dimensionally wicked as she appears. And if you try to give her a human approach in your exams, taking into consideration that she is a product of the society she lived in, and a victim of it as well in many ways, it will give you an interesting and unique angle to talk about, which always leads to a better grade. But what do you think? Does Mrs. Birling have any redeeming qualities? Let me know in the comments.